Welcome to episode 40 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by actual FBI cases. In this episode, we speak with retired agent Bob Cromwell. Bob served 22 years with the FBI. In the early part of his career, Bob was assigned cases under the Violent Crimes Program and investigated dangerous fugitive matters. Bob is interviewed about his investigation and capture of two fugitives wanted for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, otherwise known as UFAP. One of the fugitives was a rapist, and the other the murderer of a well-known New Orleans Catholic priest. Following his success as a field agent, Bob moved up the management ranks and retired as the special agent in charge of the Jacksonville Division. Bob currently serves on the board and is actually board chairman of the Innocence Project of Florida, working to exonerate innocent people sent to prison for crimes they did not commit. In this episode, Bob is also interviewed about his fight to correct and prevent wrongful convictions. His new book, Fugitive Man, Hunting Violent Criminals for the FBI and Searching for Justice for the Innocent Convict, covers his FBI career and Innocence Project work. Bob can be contacted via his website, fugitiveman.com. This was a highly informative interview. Bob is able to give you some insights into the investigative tools that the FBI uses to get subjects to cooperate. You'll find the FBI's interviewing techniques totally different than the way they show interrogations on TV, books, and movies. Bob also gives us some fascinating details, stats, and information about the number of people who may be in jail for crimes they didn't commit. Before we get to that interview, I want to make sure that you know Pay to Play, my crime novel, is doing quite well over at Amazon.com. I've got lots of great reviews and mostly 5-star ratings from you, the podcast listeners. So I want to thank you so much for your support. If you want to show me your love for all these great episodes, a great way that you can do that is by checking out Pay to Play, either the ebook or the trade paperback, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And one last thing. I think I forgot to mention something that I'm very proud of. I was honored by the Mystery Writers of America's New York chapter this month on their website with what they call a mugshot, which is an author profile. I thought I gave some great insights on what it's like to publish your first novel. So if you're interested in reading that, you can find that profile on my website under News and Events. Now here's the show. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome my guest, Bob Cromwell. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Jerry.
I had a chance to read your book. It's called Fugitive Man, Hunting Violent Criminals for the FBI and Searching for Justice for the Innocent Convict. So what I thought we would do is, pick out two of your fugitive cases and really concentrate on those. But I'm really excited about talking about wrongful convictions. I think it's really fascinating when you hear about law enforcement officials working to free people who may have been wrongly convicted. So that's going to be an exciting part of our interview, too. But before we get into any of that, could you tell me a little bit more about you? When you joined the FBI, why you joined the FBI?
Sure. Actually, my law enforcement career started in New Jersey as a police officer, and I did that for almost 4 years. Then I jumped ship there and became an NIS, well, now it's called NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Service Special Agent, and I did that for almost 3 years. And then I joined the FBI. Joined in Boston, Massachusetts, 1984. My first office was Houston, Texas. I spent 8 years there. Went to headquarters for a couple of years. Then I went to Phoenix, Arizona for 3 years. Back to headquarters for a little bit more than a couple of years. Then to Jackson, Mississippi for 3 years. And then once again back to headquarters for a couple of years. And then finally I went to Jacksonville, and I spent a couple of years in Jacksonville and then retired.
Were you dragging a wife and family along with you on all of these assignments?
Oh, yeah. My wife and I have 3 sons, and in the travels, as of Mississippi, we only had one of them with us. But other than that, the other 2 boys, the 3 of them, moved with us all over the country. I sat down one time. I think my wife and I have moved 12 times.
I'm an Air Force brat, and I think we've made about 13 moves, too. So I can relate to what they went through as far as having to introduce themselves to new schoolmates almost every couple of years.
Yeah, the one good thing about it is my 3 sons are very close to one another. We live in Florida now, and the 3 of them with their families are all within a couple miles of us.
That says a lot about your choice to make a lot of moves, that they've all decided to settle in one area and not make any.
That's true.
All right, let's talk about some of these fugitive cases.
Okay.
Which one do you want to start with?
Let me tell you about Jeffrey Holt.
Okay.
Jeffrey Holt was wanted out of Central California, the Sacramento division, for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution for kidnapping, robbery, rape, and attempted murder. Jeffrey had broken into a woman's house late one evening and had brutalized her, had beaten her, had raped her, had sodomized her, attempted to kill her, was almost successful, and ran. And after the local police investigated the matter and identified him and went about searching for him, they decided that he must have crossed state lines, and they requested the Sacramento division to get an unlawful flight to avoid prosecution warrant for him, which they did.
Could you explain that a little bit more for the listeners? So this is a local case, a local attempted murder case, and now it becomes a federal violation. Could you explain that?
Sure. When a police department, law enforcement agency, has a case on someone where they have indicted them for a felony, if they have reason to believe that the person has crossed state lines, has left the state, they can request the FBI to assist them. And the warrant is an unlawful flight to avoid prosecution warrant. There's also, if someone has done something of significance, a felony crime, and has escaped, there's a warrant called an unlawful flight to avoid custody. And, in this case, in Sacramento, Jeffrey Holt was the subject of an unlawful flight to avoid prosecution for all those violent crimes he committed.
And that's needed as far as the federal violation, because one state does not have the jurisdiction to travel to another state in order to conduct investigations?
That's primarily correct. Normally, if they do travel, they end up being teamed up with a member of another police department. It's sometimes more efficient just to let the FBI take it.
So part of this is also a cost-effective way of handling matters. Absolutely,
and also resource-effective, because the FBI has more local resources normally than most police departments. In Jeffrey's case, Sacramento had developed some information that gave us a general idea what area he may be in Texas. And then working with some informant information, we found a hotel south of Houston by several miles, and we came to the belief that Jeff was working there as a bartender.
And how did you get that information?
It was a combination of information provided through sources in Sacramento and sources in Texas that enabled us to focus in.
So once you've established that he is at this hotel, what do you do?
Another agent and I went down to the hotel dressed casually. We went into the bar and we started playing pool. Had a few iced teas, and it's not Long Island iced tea, regular iced tea with lemon.
Okay, you are working.
Working, that's correct. And Jeff came wandering in. We saw him and we grabbed him before he had a chance to even put his apron on, and admitted freely who he was. We handcuffed him and took him back to headquarters.
And once you get back to headquarters, which is, of course, the local FBI field office, does he talk to you? Are you able to get him to provide any information about the original attempted murder case?
Well, the idea when you get somebody in custody is to take advantage of the fact that you're the first one to talk to them. Because if a guy gets in jail, normally the jailhouse lawyers will be advising him immediately not to say anything. So when you take him into custody, no matter what the agency is, when you take the person into custody, the first time you grab him is the time to try to get him to speak. So we took him back to the office in Houston, and a young agent was with me, was along for the ride. He sat down with me and Jeff, and we basically had a conversation. I'm a real believer in interviews being very similar to car sales. You develop rapport, you minimize, in car sales, you minimize the purchase price, you rationalize it. Well, in talking to somebody who's done something terrible, you develop rapport, you minimize what they've been accused of, which is kind of tough sometimes when you're talking about really violent crime, but you still do it. You rationalize and you come to the closing. Now, in car sales, that would be, getting the person to buy. In interviewing a felon, it's getting him to talk. So we sat down. It was interesting. We're talking about football and basketball. We even talked about bartending, something I don't know anything about. I asked the young agent with us to go grab Jeff a Pepsi, and he did. And he came back and asked me if he could see me out in the hallway. So I went out in the hallway, and the young agent said he couldn't understand why I was being nice to this guy. He couldn't stand to be in the same room with him. And I told him, we'll talk about this later. Just go with me here. We're trying to come to an understanding of what this guy is capable of and what he did. So we went back, and basically I convinced Jeff that I knew he was guilty. I was just looking for an explanation. He seemed like a decent person, and there must be a logical explanation for what he had done. And finally, without too much hesitation, he stated that he had a drug problem and he had been high, and he remembered seeing this attractive woman in her house. And he remembered going through a window, but the rest of it was lost to him. He didn't remember anything else. Well, that's a confession, and that's really all we needed at that point in time. I told the young agent, actually, afterwards, I mentioned to him, I said, we may have just prevented the victim from having to go through a trial, which would have been like going through an assault again, as you know. So, and as it turned out, in the long run, it did. Partly because of the confession, he went to court and pled, and he's still in prison. This occurred, I want to say 1988, and he's still a guest of the California Department of Corrections.
That's really interesting how you explain your investigative method, because, so many times on, TV and in movies, they show it as an adversarial interview, very aggressive. You might have a good cop, bad cop, or one of them's being nice. But everybody in the room in this particular case were really trying to put Holt at ease.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's, in my opinion, in my experience, you get a lot more by taking that route of developing rapport, minimizing, rationalizing. Lots of times people want to talk to you if you're just decent to them.
Yeah, and I agree. I use the same method.
I've met a couple that were actually fairly decent human beings. I don't include people who commit rapes in that category. I actually went after a bank robber one time, very significant bank robbery, and I had great confidence the kid's going to turn out well once he did his time in jail. And I never found out. He went to prison for 10 years, federal prison, which means he spent at least 8.5 in prison. But I had a feeling he was going to make it on the outside. He just made a really stupid mistake.
Yeah, it's just about choices, bad choices.
That's right.
So what kind of time did Holt get?
I believe his sentence was 35 to life, and he's still in prison. So he's already, I guess he's right at 30 years now. He's still in prison. I checked last week, actually.
And what happens to that UFAP warrant and the UFAP charge once we locate a fugitive and they're returned back to their state to face the local prosecution?
Normally, in almost all cases, It is then dismissed by the local magistrate. The warrant is dismissed. The individual is returned to the jurisdiction that asked us to find him to begin with. The one exception to that I'm aware of was James Earl Ray. When James Earl Ray was arrested over in, I believe, in England, the law required that he be prosecuted for the charge he was being arrested for over there, which was unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. So besides being convicted of the killing of Dr. King, he was also convicted of unlawful flight to avoid prosecution.
Oh, that's interesting. So you haven't mentioned the fact that you were also on SWAT.
I was for about 7 years.
Okay. And this is also in Houston?
Yes, it was. My job working Fugitives really benefited from working SWAT because it gave you a lot of tactical practice, and it made you feel a little bit more comfortable. In our fugitive cases, we frequently entered residences, and the practice we got in SWAT in clearing houses, clearing structures, was reassuring for me.
And so you had that background, that knowledge base from having gone through SWAT training. And was that SWAT training in Houston, or did you actually travel to Quantico to participate in the SWAT training that they have there?
It was 2 weeks in Quantico, and it was really good training. The instructor was very good. They trained us with wax bullets, and this was before our wax bullets were commercially available, because the instructor was making them at home. And if it was cold out, they got quite hard, and they would, I would say they'd almost draw blood, but that's not really correct. They would draw blood if they hit you in the arm. So we wore our vests, we wore throat protectors, and we wore goggles. And it's probably as realistic firearms training as you could possibly have. You don't want to be shot because it hurts.
Wow. So he was actually making wax bullets at home, like what, in his oven?
That's correct. I think the ones now are made with a consistency that's a little bit softer, so I've been told.
Yeah, I'm sure you wished he had gotten a little softer wax when he was baking them.
Yeah, that's a fact.
All right, so it's good to know that you've had this, SWAT training behind you as you are, looking for these dangerous fugitives. And I know that one of the stories in your book, and I hate to call them stories because they're real cases, look very fascinating. And it was the story of a guy named Hamilton and a priest. Could you tell us about that one?
Sure. That was Marcus Hamilton. Marcus was a convict and needed a place to stay, and was introduced to a very well-liked parish priest in New Orleans, Father Patrick McCarthy. He was a very dedicated Catholic priest. He worked in an urban area of New Orleans, and he was well-liked by people there. Father McCarthy gave Marcus a place to stay, gave him a room in the rectory to stay in. And after a little bit past a week, the church secretary who worked in the rectory let Father McCarthy know that he concerned her. She was scared of him. There was something about him that scared her. So after 8 days as their guest, Father McCarthy told Marcus Hamilton he had to move out the next day. Time to move on. The next day, when Father McCarthy didn't show up for an early meeting, they sent someone into the rectory to look for him, and they found him dead, beat to death. Particularly brutal beating. I can tell you he was first hit in the head with a hammer-like object. He was then bound and tied. This is coming from the medical examiner's report. Thereafter, an extension cord was wrapped around his neck, and he was stabbed several times in the throat. Then they poured salt down his throat.
Oh.
And when he was still alive, Marcus and his half-brother had come to help him. They wrapped the extension cord further around his neck, and the two of them pulled on it for the better part of 15 minutes, at which time, during that time, Father McCarthy died. And then Marcus Hamilton took Father McCarthy's Chevy Blazer and ran.
Wow. That sounds absolutely horrendous and brutal.
It was particularly brutal. I saw photos of the crime scene, and I read the coroner's report. It was a particularly brutal crime.
Is this something that Marcus Hamilton had done before? Had he ever been arrested or charged or even suspected of any type of violent crime before?
Yes, he had. And as a matter of fact, in conversation with Marcus after we arrested him, he just matter-of-factly told us about a couple other people he'd killed.
Wow, that no one even suspected him of.
He was subsequently charged and convicted of another murder.
Wow. Tell me about how you got involved in the case. This is another UFAP, I take it.
This was an unlawful flight to avoid prosecution for capital murder that was obtained by the New Orleans office of the FBI. And using this court orders and using technology that the phone company had at that time it was for fraud investigations, we were able to locate an area in Texas where a phone was being used to call Hamilton's mother. And it was my experience, no matter what the crime was, if Mama was still alive, fugitives like to call their mother. That's just as simple as that. Lots and lots of times we caught people because of contact with their mother. Now, all this has changed since the advent of cellular phones, so it's all new technology now. Back then, this was 1987, we were relying on landlines, so landlines were important. But we found an apartment in Baytown, Texas, which is about 30 miles east of Houston, where his mother was being called from that apartment. So Andy Tully, who's the late Andy Tully, was a really good agent in Houston, and my friend Phil Stooks is another really good agent who's just recently retired in Houston. The three of us went down to Baytown.
How long after the actual murder? How long was he a fugitive?
Only about a week.
Okay, so this is just a week later.
So this was kind of a hot case, as you can imagine. We went down to the house, and there was an apartment. It was an end unit apartment, and I had a hard hat in my car. I gave it to Phil Stooks to put on. He had a notepad in front of him with a hard hat, and Andy Tully and I stayed around the corner with our backs up against the wall. And then when Phil Stooks knocked on the door, I heard a man answer, and I simply spun around with my gun in my hand, and Andy Tully, Phil Stooks, and I basically had the drop on him and took him into custody.
Oh, so he actually came, Marcus Hamilton was the one who came to the door.
Actually, he was the only one there. His girlfriend was at work.
Did you know that? Had you done a surveillance of the apartment?
We had surveilled it for a while, and we saw that Father McCarthy's Chevy Blazer was parked there, and that the space reserved for his girlfriend's space, that space was empty. So again, we took Marcus Hamilton back to the Houston office of the FBI and sat down and started talking. It was Phil Stooks and I did the interview. We talked for quite some time, and for the longest time, all he would admit to was that he had stolen Father McCarthy's Chevy. And again, we were quite nice to him. We bought him drinks and bought him a snack, just continued to talk to him. I had a thought. I decided to give him an excuse for his violence. Now, it's not a really good excuse as far as I'm concerned, and sometimes I wondered if I was right to do it. But I said to him, I said, I thought maybe Father McCarthy was hitting on you. In other words, coming on to him sexually. And I doubt very much that was the case, but I saw Marcus look at me, and all of a sudden his eyes got kind of brighter. And that's all it took. All of a sudden he says, yeah, he was all over me. And from there, the confession just rolled out of him. He gave graphic details of what he and his brother had done to the priest. Rather disturbing case. It was New Year's Eve, 1987. We started the interview on New Year's Eve afternoon. And I remember it quite well because we had neighbors over at the house for a cookout and fireworks, and I wasn't there. Basically, we spent 6 hours with Marcus, but it was friendly. It was not. We didn't put a real hard pressure on him. We just talked to him. When we offered him an out, when we offered him an excuse for what he had done, he grabbed onto it and ran with it.
Now, when you were first telling me about it, you were a little hesitant, and you even questioned whether or not you should have done it. How do you feel about that now? It sounds like it worked.
Well, I feel like it worked. Yeah, I know that it worked, and which is fine. But the thought that someone would use someone coming on to them as an excuse for murder is kind of a disturbing thought. That's all. That was all. It kind of disturbed me to think that somebody would do that. That's all.
Yeah, and I can understand that. But again, you had a law enforcement purpose.
Absolutely.
And the people who cared about the priest would have given you a buy, I'm sure, to use whatever means necessary, in order to get that confession.
It was an interesting thing happened too. There was a suppression hearing where the defense tried to suppress the confession that Marcus gave us, and Phil Stukes and I testified at that suppression hearing. When I walked into the courtroom, Marcus turned and smiled at me. I mean, he remembered me, and clearly, it wasn't a bad thing. He remembered me, and the trial with him was interesting because a couple things. One, there was about 6 priests there that were there to watch the trial. The courtroom was always full, and I noticed that the priests were approached individually by one or the other of the defense attorneys. They all seemed to be asked the same question, Father, what do you think of the death penalty? And without exception, every one of them said, I'm not really sure. Which tells me, the Catholic Church as an organization may be against the death penalty, but you shouldn't kill a priest, or if you kill a priest, don't count on them standing by you.
Wow, and this was a capital murder case, you were saying?
Yes, it was. And the trial took a couple days. The jury went out at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I remember they brought Kentucky Fried Chicken in for dinner for the jury. So the jury had a Kentucky Fried Chicken dinner, and at 6:30 came back with a guilty verdict.
Doesn't sound like it took them too long to deliberate.
An hour and a half.
Now, what's the deal with Marcus's brother? Was he tried at the same time?
No, he was a separate trial and was given life without parole. And then Marcus, the next day, they had the second phase of the trial, which was the sentencing portion of it, and where the defense puts on a case for him not to get the death penalty, and the prosecutor puts on a case for Marcus to get the death penalty. After the presentations were made, the jury went, to discuss it. They came back after a couple hours with some questions for the judge, which he answered, and then they went away for another couple hours. And they came back, and I looked at the jurors as they walked in, and I noticed a couple of them were crying, and I knew right away they were going to give him the death penalty, and they did. They sentenced him to death. Subsequently, he was in prison in Angola on death row and had a stroke, a fairly serious stroke. And after having the stroke, on an appeal, his sentence was changed from the death sentence to life without the possibility of parole. He is a convict in Angola.
And how old was he at the time of this sentencing?
When he was arrested, he was 27.
And when he had his stroke?
I want to say he was probably 31, 32.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Especially. And I'm not sure. I mean, I'm one of those people who are kind of ambivalent about the death penalty too. But I'm not sure if having a stroke is a reason for you to have your sentence changed.
Well, I was in on arrests for people who got the death penalty. I was in on cases where the person that I was working on subsequently got the death penalty. In one case in particular, the guy abducted a 9-year-old child, and I helped find him. He was executed. But personally, I'm against the death penalty.
And I know why, which is the same reason that I'm ambivalent about it. So why don't we talk about that? Because this is what's so fascinating to me, that you spent a good part of your career hunting down dangerous fugitives that have been convicted, are charged with violent crimes and convicted. But at some point in your career or some point in your retirement, you can let me know which one, you started looking at some of the convictions and some of the situations in the justice system, and you started to question it. Tell us more about that. Well,
even as a police officer, I saw that the criminal justice system is not always a level playing field. If you have resources, if you have money, you're going to get different treatment in the justice system than if you don't. If you have the services of very competent paid attorneys, you're going to do better most of the time than you would do with a public defender. The public defender system in this country is overwhelmed. Now, if you look at the National Registration of Exonerations, which is a project done by the University of Michigan Law School, it's been cataloging the people who have been exonerated since 1989. And it's interesting to look at it. And again, their numbers are really, they're underreporting because they rely on self-reporting by defense attorneys to find out who's been exonerated. But since 1989, as of last week, there's been 1,877 exonerations in the United States.
And so these are people who were convicted of a crime, went to jail, and later were able in somehow, some way to prove their innocence and get released. And
that's an important point when you say prove their innocence, because these are not technically innocent people. These are people that are actually innocent. Of that 1,877, 747 of those are white people. 874 are black, 221 are Latino. 348 of those exonerated had been sentenced to life in prison. 91 had been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, and 116 had been sentenced to death. And so, in other words, 116 people were sitting on death row when they were exonerated by the criminal justice system. I say when they were exonerated. One person, Frank Lee Smith, here in Florida, his case went on after he died. He died of cancer that might have had a different outcome if he had been a free man. He died of cancer in prison, and 6 months after he died, DNA exonerated him. Oh. And speaking of DNA, of that number that I gave you, of that 1,877, only 427 were aided by DNA. The rest of the cases didn't have the advantage of DNA being even available. 569 of those cases featured mistaken witness identification. The process of witness identification is really, really not reliable the way it's set up now, especially cross-race. If you're an African American and you see, say, an Asian or a white person commit a crime, you're not going to recognize that person as well as you would recognize another African American. If you're white and you see somebody of a different race, you're not. It's a fact. If the person you're looking at is a different race than you are, you don't see them the same way. And the current process where they put 6 photos together in a 6-pack simply is not consistently correct. There's too many errors made. There's frequently the person who is the actual suspect most matches the description given to the person of the suspect. They end up picking out the person because they think he looks the most like the suspect, and that's not the way it should be handled. The other causes, though, there's, believe it or not, there's a significant number of false confessions. Over 200 of that 1,800 number where people confessed to crimes they didn't commit.
Now, why? I mean, that is something that I've seen. Why?
Sometimes it's because they're convicted by the investigator that it will be better for them, it'll be easier for them to confess. The case is so strong that if you go to court, you're going to really get nailed. But if you confess, we'll be nicer to you. Sometimes it's just a very weak person who will confess to anything. That happens sometimes. Sometimes the person gets so beat down by the long-term interview that they would confess to anything just to enter an interview.
And that says a lot about the interview tactics that you used before you even began working on this project. You've always used one that is low-key and more of rapport building, and I would take it that lessens the possibility of somebody confessing to something that they really didn't do.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
And so these really mean, adversarial, angry, threatening interviews can be the cause of somebody falsely confessing to a crime they didn't do.
Yeah, I personally believe that there are literally thousands of innocent people in prison. And that's not counting plea bargaining. plea bargaining results in innocent people going to prison all the time because the defense attorney will convince the person that they've got you, the evidence is against you, we can make this plea bargain. So the person, even though he's innocent, is so oppressed by the system that he will admit to a crime he didn't commit to keep from having to go to trial.
And I guess in some situations, and I'm not saying this is in all situations, but some of those defendants may have been guilty of something. They may have been living a lifestyle where they were guilty of something, but this particular crime that was against them, they had not done, and so they confessed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of these people are coming from a history that is not pristine.
Now, let me ask you this, because this is really fascinating for me. Is there a personal story, a personal connection that made you start working on this Innocence Project?
Not really. I saw cases when I was a police officer. One case I was involved in was a sexual assault. We were focusing on one person. It was the state of New Jersey vehicle. It was an unusual vehicle. It was a Dodge Colt, I believe. It was orange with a black interior. There was only 35 in the state of New Jersey registered. We found a guy a couple communities over from where I was working. He looked like the artist's rendition of our suspect. Our victim said that there were 3 rotten apple cores on the floor of the car. I walked by there in the middle of the night and looked at the floor of the car. The car was parked down the street, and there was 3 rotten apple cores there. And right at that point in time, I'd have bet almost anything he was guilty.
Right.
Everything,
same car, looked like the guy,
exactly.
An apple core.
Everything pointed to him, and it wasn't him.
Oh, it wasn't?
We were on our way to court. We were on our way to the district attorney's office to have him appear in a court-ordered lineup when I got a call that one of our patrol officers had picked up a guy who looked just like our guy. And the guy that was picked up didn't look as much like the drawing as the guy that we were taking for the lineup. But when the guy that was picked up was put in the lineup, immediately our victim picked him out. And then furthermore, the guy admitted to having, he said it was consensual, but he admitted to being the person. So we were on the verge of prosecuting somebody. If the victim had been run over by a car or something, we probably had a good enough case to go after this guy and convict him.
Or if the victim just didn't really get a good look at the guy.
Yeah, exactly.
So did the guy who actually confessed to it, saying that it was consensual, did he have the same car and
exactly same car, and even had apple cores on the floor?
What?
Yeah. And then again, when I was an NIS agent, I saw situations where it was exactly a level playing field. That if you were senior enough, you could get away with crimes that would put other people in jail. And in the FBI, I saw examples of it also that made me realize our system is not always, not a completely fair system, and not always a level playing field.
Now, you said something about in the FBI you saw that. Could you give me an example of what you saw?
Well, for instance, one of the things the FBI would do would be work on parental kidnappings, where a parent of a child without permission of the court would take the child and run. And I had one time in Houston where the warrant was for a woman for interference with child custody, and I tracked her down through her daughter. I went through the school system and found where her daughter was going to school and followed the child home one day. The woman and child came out, and I grabbed the woman. And the woman was an immigrant, didn't speak English very well, but the child spoke very, very good English. And she said that my mother ran because my father has been beating her. And she said, "Mr. Cromwell, have you ever seen The Burning Bed?" And for those who don't know, that's a movie that starred Farrah Fawcett about a woman who was being beat by her husband, and she killed him. And this child said to me, The Burning Bed was a movie my mother could identify with. And come to find out, this wealthy husband up in Maryland, actually, was basically, as far as I could tell, was using the system to go after his wife, who was just running because she was abused. And he had the money, he had the power, and he, at the point, as far as I could see, was getting away with it. So,
as a law enforcement officer with this this UFAP warrant for this parental kidnapping, you have to turn her over.
Yeah, what I did thereafter, though, was I was acquainted with a pretty decent public defender, federal public defender, and I went to him and told him the story, asked him to help her, and not only did he help her, but he hooked her up with an attorney in Maryland to help her. And I'd like to say there was a happy ending, but quite frankly, I don't know what the ending was because I never heard anything after that. But I did what I could.
So stories like this and other ones that you've learned, since working in law enforcement have made you realize, that there are many, many instances of people being innocent, being convicted of crimes they did not commit.
Real quickly, let me tell you about Jamie Bain. Jamie Bain was a 19-year-old when he was arrested for the rape of a 9-year-old child. Jamie had been out with some friends, had come home and was sitting on the floor watching television with his sister when the police came and told them there was a problem, that he'd been picked out as somebody who might have committed a crime. And, he denied it. He said, no, not me. I've been here with my sister. Went down to the police station. He was convicted of sexual assault of a child, was sentenced to life in prison, and could have gotten the death sentence when this happened. This was 1974, I believe. Anyway, he spent 35 years in prison. After DNA became something that was available for testing, he wrote an appeal on his case himself, and then when it was turned down, he did it again. He did it 5 times. He wrote 5 appeals. On the 5th appeal, the organization that I'm affiliated with, the Innocence Project of Florida, we found out about it from an attorney, told us about it, and we contacted Jamie and said, would you like us to help? And I say we. I'm on the board. I'm not the helper. I'm a board member. These are attorneys that would do the help. And they brought a case and got him exonerated. It showed through DNA that he was not guilty. If you went back to see how it happened, Jamie Bain was accused of having had raped this child who was the nephew of a school official in the town where this happened.
Why him? Why was he the finger pointed at him?
When the child came home, the child couldn't see the assailant very well, but said he had bushy sideburns, and he said, my name is Jimmy. The school official said, well, Jamie Bain could be called Jimmy, and he has bushy sideburns. And he went and got the school yearbook and showed the child the picture. And then the police thereafter showed them pictures and said, which one is Jamie Bain? And the child picked out Jamie Bain. That was their photo identification. And then I hate to say it, but the FBI was involved in the case a little bit. The FBI testified to blood evidence that was there and testified that based on their examination, the assailant had AB blood with a high, strong B, and I'm probably misquoting this, and the expert for the defense said absolutely not. It was the other way around. It was a strong B or whatever. There was a difference of opinion from the 2 laboratory experts. As it turns out, the defense was right. The blood type was what they said it was when they did the DNA testing. They could prove it wasn't Jamie, and it's just a terrible thing. The kid went to prison when he was 19, got out when he was 54.
Now, we have had some very high-profile convictions overturned here in the Philadelphia area just in the last couple of weeks. So I'm sitting here and just horrified when you were repeating the numbers about how often this is occurring, and you're telling me that it's being underreported. Well, so as a former law enforcement person, I don't even know what the word to use, because it's not really anger, it's just disappointment, in a system, and I don't know what we could do about it. Our role as law enforcement officials, and agents and officers, is to go out and make sure justice is served, that the people who commit crimes are put behind bars. What do we do?
There's some things we can do.
Okay.
Appropriate standards for eyewitness identification that can be agreed to, like the International Association of Chiefs of Police. I think they're getting to the point where they recognize it. So there should be set standards. And it has to do with a blind process where the officer, the investigator, doesn't know what the witness is looking at as they're looking at the pictures. In other words, the the investigator steps back and the witness looks at the pictures without any coaching, without any communication while this is going on. They're given, and it doesn't have to be 6. More likely it could be 15, 20. It doesn't really make that much difference as long as they're given to them shuffled and the investigator doesn't know which one is which. He stands back and lets the person go through, tells the person, the person who did this crime may or may not be in this group. So they're not pushed to absolutely make an identification. Also, the standards for forensic examinations have to be established. As you've probably heard, we've had real issues with hair analysis. There's 1,000 cases out there where the FBI testified as to the accuracy of hair being probably from, getting percentages that was probably from a suspect. And as it turns out, that is not good science. So there needs to be standards. I think all interviews, and not just the confession part, but the whole interview from start to finish should be recorded.
Ooh, now that's going to be something that you're going to get a lot of pushback because the FBI does not normally record interviews.
It should be required from start to finish. That gives the jury and the judge the ability to understand the circumstances where a confession occurs. I wish I had been able to record mine. I really do. You don't have to look at this as something where, by the way, I'm recording this, because that wouldn't necessarily be required. In the federal system, there's only one person, one party has to give permission for the recording. So it wouldn't be really an issue in the federal system. And on the state side, they'd have some states allow one person authorization and some states don't. But it really makes sense to prevent wrongful confessions from being admitted, from confessions being coerced. If you recorded the confessions, or if you can record the whole interview, that wouldn't happen. Brady versus Maryland, I believe it goes all the way back to the it might even be the 60s, is a case the Supreme Court decided that says that the prosecutors, if they have information that would assist the defense in showing that the person is innocent, they have to provide it. And routinely they don't. And there's no consequence. There needs to be consequences. If the prosecutor knows that somebody's innocent or has information that indicates they may be innocent, they have to give that information, and there should be teeth in the law to force them to do so.
Now, as you're working on this project, are you getting any type of encouragement, or are you getting pushback from other law enforcement officials and people that you encounter?
Well, we've got the former president of the IACP, Walt McNeil. He's also the former Secretary of Corrections for the state of Florida. He's also the former Secretary of Juvenile Justice for the state of Florida. He's also the former police chief, Tallahassee. He's on board with us. He sees the logic of this, as do a lot of members of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Greg Miller, Republican appointee United States Attorney for the Northern District of Florida, strong prosecutor, very much a law and order man. He sees the logic of this and was, as a matter of fact, after he finished his term at the U.S. Attorney's Office, became a member of our board of directors on the Innocence Project. So, yeah, as people look closely at this, we're not, we believe that the majority of people in prison are guilty. We're not saying that they're not. We just want people that aren't guilty to try to prevent that from happening, trying to prevent people who are innocent from going to prison.
I can't understand anybody who would be against that.
Exactly. Another issue, though, the Public Defender Corps is completely overwhelmed. And as a result, they hardly ever take a case to court. They plea bargain almost everything. And when you plea bargain almost everything, you're convincing people who are innocent to take a plea by scaring them.
Yeah, I actually saw a fascinating article that was in the New York Times about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I'll link that to the episode show notes for this episode in case anybody would like to look at that article. Now, did you see it?
Yes, I did, actually.
Yeah, fascinating. I remember tweeting it because I thought it was so interesting, and that's before we had even talked, and I even knew that we would be doing this interview. It was about plea bargaining and how it was affecting the justice system.
Right, I saw that. The other thing is, in my book, I talk about estimates of the number of innocent people in prison. And the estimates go from anywhere from 0.5% to 2.5% and more. And I talk about some studies that have occurred to try to come to some grasp of how many innocent people were in prison. And all I can say is I am absolutely convinced there's thousands of innocent people in prison.
What percentage? So that people can relate that to how many people are in prison. What percentage? Are you saying about 2% too? You're agreeing with that number?
And I think it could even be higher. It could even be higher.
We've had a chance now to mention your book several times. So if you could tell the listeners, first of all, how to find your book, if you can say the name again and where they could get it. And also, if they're interested in working with or learning more about the Innocent Project, how they would do that.
Sure. The book is Fugitive Man, Hunting Violent Criminals for the FBI and Searching for Justice for the Innocent Convict. The hardcover is going to be published on October 25th. The electronic version is available now on Amazon.com. The hardcover will be available through Amazon, through Google Books. For a discount price for the book, you can go to www.fugitiveman.com, which is my website. You can go there now and see what I've been writing about. I write about various subjects having to do with the Innocence Project. As far as the Innocence Project itself, the Florida project is floridainnocence.org. The Innocence Project, the original one up in New York, is innocenceproject.org. And I would recommend you visiting both of those places because both of them have good information to share.
Okay. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is, you rose up pretty high in the FBI. You became a special agent in charge, a full division. It was Jackson, Mississippi, right?
No, I was in Jackson, I was the assistant special agent in charge. I was the special agent in charge of the Jacksonville division.
Okay, in Florida. It sounds to me that when I'm reading your book, that what you're most proud of is not becoming, management level in the FBI, but working these fugitive cases, working, in the field. Is that true?
No, not really. I love the fugitive work. The fugitive work was my favorite work, but I felt pretty good about what I did the rest of my career too. I was pretty proud of. I made mistakes, but overall, I was pretty proud of what I did in my career. Being an SAC, being the agent in charge of a division was, to this day, I'm a little bit surprised that I made it that high. All I wanted to do growing up was I wanted to be a policeman like my big brother. Fugitive work, you felt like you were making a difference. You're taking dangerous people off the street, so that's hard to beat. But on the other hand, I was also getting older, and fugitive work is lots of times is young man's work. You need to be able to climb fences and run.
That's quite true. That's quite true. So if you could, you kind of summed up your career a little bit there in talking about being proud of both being a street agent and also being in management. But if you had to, give a last words on your career and what you think about the FBI, what would you say?
I would say that I could not have imagined a better job than the FBI. So many incredible experiences. We were making a difference in the world. 9/11 showed that we had some problems. We weren't prepared in a lot of ways. I give Director Mueller applause for turning the big ship of the FBI around to get into a mode where they're trying to prevent crime from happening, because that was not what the FBI was doing before. The FBI was there, to solve crimes for the biggest part. But generally speaking, I think it's arguably, and I think most people would agree, the finest law enforcement agency in the world. And I'm really honored to have been part of it.
And that's the end of the interview. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos of Bob, and you'll also find links to newspaper articles and reports covering Bob's capture of the murderer of that Catholic priest, an article on James Bain, his friend who was wrongly convicted for a crime he didn't commit, and reports about the wrongful convictions and the Innocence Project of Florida. And there's also that New York Times article we mentioned on the decline in criminal jury trials. And there's 2 links to Bob's book, Fugitive Man, Hunting Violent Criminals for the FBI and Searching for Justice for the Innocent Convict. There's a link in the show notes where you can find that book on Amazon and on his website. If you enjoyed the episode, I hope you share it with your friends and family. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of the episode show notes, you'll find all the social media share buttons. I am so excited about the crime recommendation I have for you today. It is Revolver by Duane Swierczynski, and it is fascinating. It's about 3 generations of Philadelphia police officers. It starts in 1965 with the cop killing of the grandfather. It moves to 1995 where his son, now a homicide detective, starts to look into that murder that was never really solved. And then it also moves to Philadelphia in 2015 where the granddaughter of the murdered police officer, a forensic science student, also attempts to reopen her grandfather's murder. So the story unfolds using those 3 perspectives, 3 points of view. I especially loved all of the references to Philadelphia. And if you are from the area, you will recognize so many places, so many streets, so many sections of towns, and even references to people, historical and current, that are mentioned in the book. The story has so many twists and turns, and they're revealed in such a clever and interesting way. Duane provides these little bits and pieces about each of the characters' personalities, like little breadcrumbs all through the book. It's very, very well done. So again, my crime fiction recommendation for this week is Revolver by Duane Swierczynski. Great book. And while you're picking that up, don't forget to also pick up Pay to Play. For those listeners who have already picked up a copy, I want to say thank you so much for doing so. The problem always with debut authors is discoverability. So I hope that those of you who have become regular listeners to the show will pick up a copy of Pay to Play at Amazon.com. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again soon for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.